السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. لعل المملكة المتحدة في كل مرة تفشل فيها في تنفيذ سياستها الخاصة فيما يتعلق بحقوق الفلسطينيين بحسب اعترافاتها، ترسل رسالة صريحة إلى الحكومة الإسرائيلية الهجينة المتمادية بتطرفها، مفادها أنه لن تكون هنالك تكلفة وعواقب على معاملة الفلسطينيين الوحشية. هذا الإفلات التام من العقاب يغذي تمادي وإمعان إسرائيل المتنامي في التطرف اليميني المتوحش، تاركة أصحاب الأرض يقاتلون من أجل أرواحهم وممنوعين حتى من التجول على الأرض التي تخصهم بكل القوانين والشرائع، وحتى من السكن في منازلهم. نتحدث اليوم عن الإعلام الغربي وفلسطين مع ستيف سويني، محرر الشؤون الدولية في صحيفة المورنينج ستار البريطانية. أهلا بكم إلى حلقة جديدة من الداخل. معكم زينب صفار، تابعونا. Steve Sweeney, Morning Star International Editor. Welcome to Min Al-Dakhil from the Inside, Steve.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks for being here, actually, Steve. Pure pleasure to have you always. Well, the Morning Star is a left-wing British daily newspaper with a focus on social, political, and trade union issues, and is both the largest and the longest-running socialist newspaper in Britain. Well, Steve, as the international editor who writes from different avenues worldwide, how are people at home still getting along with your approach of coverage and stories?
Well, I think the Morning Star offers a unique approach to stories, not just in Britain but internationally as well. And we're a different kind of newspaper from the mainstream media in that we're not owned by billionaire bosses that have their own corporate agenda, which tends to follow the line of imperialism, which is dominated by the United States interests at the moment and British interests. So our newspaper offers something very different in that we're owned by, we're a cooperative, so we're owned by our readers. And our readers tend to be the kind of supporters of a range of organisations, but progressive organisations, and we're also owned by, I think, 10 of the country's trade unions. So this represents some 6.5 million members. So whilst our circulation might not be in the millions, as the mainstream media and the biggest newspapers are, we do have the potential to hit the most advanced layers of the British public. So these are the people that are active in in politics. So what we say kind of matters. And one example of how important we are in terms of the movement, I think, was exemplified a few years ago when Jeremy Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party. Now, Jeremy was a writer for the Morning Star. He used to have a weekly column until he became rather busy when he took over as leader of the Labour Party. But he still maintained that link with the newspaper and has been very supportive of it. Now, Jeremy Corbyn represented a threat to the mainstream narrative and the narrative and the particularly of US imperialism, but also of Britain as its junior partner in that as well. And one of the key things that Jeremy represented was he represented a voice for the Palestinian people, and he posed a threat to that, to not only US imperialism but to Israel as well, because one of the things that he was advocating was recognition of the state of Palestine, and this was something that hadn't been seen in the movement or from the leader of the Labour Party for a long time. So during the Labour Party conference of 2019, just before the election, so bear in mind this is a moment where Jeremy Corbyn could have been the leader of not just the Labour Party, but he could have been Prime Minister. So this was a very significant moment. But the ambassador, Israeli ambassador to Britain, was somebody who'd be very well known to many of your viewers, I'm sure, Mark Regev, who used, in fact, the Israeli embassy in Britain as a staging post to push the agenda of the Zionist regime there.
And of course, many videos were leaked in this regard.
Many videos were leaked. The Al Jazeera report
Sure.
uncovered that there was a plot to take down or take out, I think the word was, MPs that were sympathetic to Palestine. Now, this was a time when also the anti-Semitism charges were being pushed quite aggressively within the movement. So anybody who supported or who voiced support for Palestine was branded anti-Semitic. Many of them were suspended from the Labour Party. People were really afraid to speak out. So at that time, Mark Regev wrote to me as the international editor of the Morning Star during the Labour Party conference and virtually demanded that an article he had written was published. And this was, he knew full well that the newspaper would go into the hands of every delegate at Labour Party conference. And this was an attempt for him to kind of rewrite history. And it was an appeal really to the British Labour movement as to why they should support the State of Israel as a progressive beacon of hope in the Middle East or something. I mean, we didn't publish it because our newspaper is very...
What did you say to him?
Well, he phoned me a number of times, or he got his assistant to phone me a number of times and emailed me, and I told him that I think initially I responded by saying I hadn't seen the article and we would have to look at it and it will be considered as all submissions are considered. In other words, you don't have a right to be published in the newspaper just because you're the Israeli ambassador. And I think he was kind of wrong-footed by that because he expected to get his own way. And when we didn't publish it, I told him that it's not in line with the editorial line of our newspaper. We won't be publishing it. He was very angry about that and expressed his disappointment.
Right. But this also mattered, this issue regarding the issue of Palestine and how sensitive it has become, perhaps today more than ever in the West. Allow me here to move on to Germany. In a flagrant move recently by Germany, just weeks after the Israeli appalling 11-day aggression and bombardment of Gaza, and after tens of thousands of people took to the streets across the country demanding freedom, justice and liberation for Palestine, it is attempting to criminalize the Palestinian resistance via legislation that would ban the display of Hamas flags, a bill backed by all major parties. Steve, when a bill is backed by all major parties to the extent that not to naturalize certain kind of people who are going to take to the streets in protest of what is going on against Palestine. How do you read such kind of pressures?
Well, I think this is obviously a bill that has been drafted by the State of Israel. I mean, we need to be quite clear about that, I think. And you're seeing this criminalization of resistance. Now, you can argue about Hamas, and you don't have to agree or disagree. I don't think with the politics of Hamas. That isn't really the issue. Hamas is the democratically elected government in the Gaza Strip, whether you like it or not. And it's not up to Westerners or people or anybody else to determine how the Palestinians resist what is happening. And I think we're seeing in Germany this attempt to criminalize, and they're using Hamas, which is used actually across the entire of the Western media to kind of delegitimize the resistance. They'll say things like, the BBC will report Israel responds to Hamas incendiary balloons. Well, actually, Israel is I think the fourth largest military on the planet, a nuclear power, and it's committing war crimes against a besieged people. And they have the right to resist, and they have the right to express that in whichever way they want. So this isn't really about the Hamas flag. That's a bit of a red herring. But I mean, in Germany, for example, they want to ban the Hamas flag, but at the same time, during Israel's onslaught, which killed more than 250 Palestinians, 66 of whom were children. In an attack that targeted hospitals, roads to hospitals, that targeted journalists and journalist buildings to try and hide the atrocities that they're committing there. I know at least one journalist was killed, and at the same time these crimes were being committed. The German state and German government buildings displayed the Israeli flag as a show of solidarity with not just the Jewish community in Germany. They can do that other ways. But this was a show of solidarity with the Israeli government, and this was in effect saying, we support what you're doing to the Palestinian people. We saw it not just in Germany. Joe Biden did exactly the same thing in a telephone call to then Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and said, we support you. We support Israel's right to defend itself.
He couldn't make the green light even greener,
Well, he did make it greener.
Yes.
By then declaring that he was going to give 715 million US dollars.
Exactly.
In arms sales, whilst these atrocities were being committed. Now, yeah, you couldn't be any more blatant about your about your position.
But the issue here is that the Morning Star's National Union of Journalists, Chapel, stood in solidarity, as you said, with the journalists from Al Jazeera, from AP, and others following Israel's heinous attack on a media building, considering it as war crime by rights group. Yet, what is the reason behind the National Union of Journalists' pathetic timidity in refusing to back Palestinians at the recent conference? How do you explain that? How do you describe that in light of the issue with Palestine and the media in the West?
Yeah. Well, I think the National Union of Journalists conference was really quite shocking in terms of its failure to support the Palestinian people. This was something that was actually surprising to me. Now, journalism, unfortunately, the majority of journalists in Britain are predominantly middle class, and they predominantly come from media organisations that are bankrolled, as I've said, by billionaires who have their own vested interests and support the Israeli regime. Now, there was a group of us that amended motions. What we called for very clearly was in line with what the Palestinian Journalists Syndicate, the main organisation operating on the ground in the occupied territories, is saying. Now, they wanted a number of things. One was support for the boycott, divestment and sanctions campaign, to isolate Israel as a pariah state and to stop trading with goods that had been stolen from Palestinians in the occupied territories, and this is a global movement.
Sure, the BDS.
The BDS movement. It was also calling for responsible reporting as well, and this was what you're seeing through the corporate media and the BBC and all the other kind of mainstream newspapers. Descriptions like, for example, clashes between Israeli far-right Zionist settlers and Palestinians that were in their own neighbourhood. These weren't clashes. Yeah. This was an attack.
Yeah, it was coercive eviction. Coercive cleansing of the Palestinians from their homes and their land.
Exactly, and the use of the term eviction, it gives it a legitimacy that it shouldn't have. And the same in terms of the Israeli onslaught. They were calling it a conflict, but it isn't a conflict. There are two sides in this, and the oppressor and the oppressed. And as journalists, it's our job really to give a voice to the oppressed people. But we were told at the National Union of Journalists conference, when I moved the motion in support of media workers for Palestine and to support the Palestinian people, we were told it is not our job to give a voice to Palestinians, which
and this is very appalling.
It's shocking.
We will talk more, Steve, into the issue of your duty when it comes to Palestine and the Palestinians, and how to steer the debate and the discussions and the coverage, and what to write and what not to write about. But allow us to stop now for a short break. إذا فاصل قصير ونعود، لا تذهبوا بعيدا. البارونة وورسي وهي عضو بارز في مجلس اللوردات قالت في خطابها أمام المجلس إن بعض الوزراء البريطانيين يرفض حتى استخدام اسم فلسطين. لدينا سياسة لعملية السلام، لكن لا نرغب في المبادرة إلى عملية السلام أو جعلها من الأولويات. وأضافت وورسي: حكومتنا تفشل في تنفيذ سياستها المعلنة. لدينا سياسة تعتبر بناء المستوطنات غير قانوني ويتعارض مع القانون الدولي، ومع ذلك لا تفرض أي عواقب حين يعمد كل عام المزيد من المستوطنين المدعومين من الحكومة الإسرائيلية وجماعات الشتات إلى احتلال المزيد من الأراضي في فلسطين. فنقف مكتوفي الأيدي ولا نردع إسرائيل عن توسيع المستوطنات والإخلاء القسري وهدم المنازل بحسب وورسي. ستيف سويني محرر الشؤون الدولية في صحيفة مورنينج ستار البريطانية، لماذا برأيه تتصرف المملكة المتحدة بنفاق مطلق وتعجز عن توبيخ إسرائيل على ممارساتها الوحشية واحتلالها غير القانوني لفلسطين؟
Well, I think it's important to note that this criticism came from Baroness Varsi, who is she's a Tory. As she said, as you said, she was at the centre of government. She was the former chair of the party, so she's not an insignificant figure. And for somebody to be critical of government policy in such a way, I think is a major step. But it shows just how far the government has gone in terms of its support for Israel. Now, we can look at the reasons why. I mean, the British government will often make statements that it has no intention of backing, but really, Britain has no independent foreign policy. That's what we need to recognise here. That the British foreign policy, when it hasn't had an independent foreign policy for decades, so the actions of the British government are really carried out on behalf of US imperialism. These two are in hoc. Britain once was the biggest empire in the world, and it occupied many of the countries, and of course it historically has played a pernicious role in Palestine, and
in the whole Middle East, in the whole West Asia region.
Of course, in the whole of the region, Britain has colluded with France, with the US, and with the imperialist powers to carve up this the region that we're in now. And I think many of the problems that we're seeing today can be traced back to that history, and including in Palestine. So Britain has a historic responsibility actually to stand with the Palestinian people, because the suffering of the Palestinian people today at the hands of Israel is directly attributable to the British government. And this is something that they've completely washed their hands of any kind of responsibility. But of course Israel serves not just the purpose of US imperialism in the Middle East, it also serves the purpose of British imperialism in the Middle East too, which is why that Israel is allowed to act with absolute impunity. So sure. It can continue to do these things, and the British government might make statements that are critical or criticise Israel for its expansionist project, but this is what they say for public consumption behind closed doors. Of course, they not only actively support it, they encourage it. They continue with huge trade deals with Israel.
And here, allow me to ask you, Steve, please, how fundamental and much demanded is it for you as Western journalists to educate people on oppression in Palestine and the plight of its people, so future generations will know and have knowledge to take a stand against the whole-scale abuses of human rights and crimes against humanity and against the real owners of the land?
I think it's absolutely essential that we do this, and that we hold not only our political leaders to account, but that we tell the story and we give a voice to the Palestinian people, because they're the ones that are the best people to tell their story. And that story is critical, I think, in shaping how people view what's happening on the ground. Now, if you look at the actions of the British people against the actions of the British public, you'll see that they're very, very different. For example, a number of weeks ago now, when the Israeli bombardment of Gaza started, there was a demonstration called by the Palestine Solidarity Campaign in Britain. Now, bear in mind that the country was just coming out of coronavirus lockdown, and the organisers were anticipating a good turnout would be 5,000. I mean, this is the first major demonstration that had been called. 200,000 people.
200,000 people
took to the streets. I mean, this is a
clear
huge
message.
Demonstration, and what it shows is that whilst the British government might support what the Israeli government is doing to the people of Palestine, the people of Britain are 100% in solidarity with the Palestinian people, and that's very, very important, I think, because that pressure, and we need that pressure, because it is we can write articles, which we do, detailing the atrocities that are being committed, but it is it's the mass movement that will really kind of help to put that pressure and isolate Israel. And the British government isn't immune to this kind of thing. It does, while it might pretend to be, it will take notice of people on the streets, because that's it's the mass movements, and we take that kind of into the mass organisations of the working class in Britain. And you've seen how this can be effective as well in other countries, like in America and Canada and Italy, where there have been there's been strike action in ports that have blocked ships from taking arms and other goods to Israel. So it's that kind of action, and that's kind of what we need, that to build that critical mass movement, the same way that the apartheid regime in South Africa was brought down. These regimes are built on sand. They don't last forever, by the way, and I think that's one thing that that we should recognise. But I think that mass action, the BDS campaign, is really important in this respect. But those actions can help isolate and bring down the regime. So our newspaper, the Morning Star, is the voice of the labour movement in Britain, and what we say is read by up to 6.5 million trade unionists. So it's important. It's important.
From the UK, Steve Sweeny, Morning Star International Editor, thank you very much for joining us, for your deep and thorough insights.
Thank you.
Always welcome, always a pleasure. والشكر لكم مشاهدينا الكرام على طيب المتابعة. للتفاعل أكثر تابعونا على صفحات السوشيال ميديا من كل فريق عمل من الداخل من كل الميادين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.